Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And you're tuning into this episode, which is occurring during our Foreign Policy Week. And for this topic, this time I brought on Eric Sammons. Now, Eric is the editor-in-chief at Crisis magazine. And if you're not one to peruse Catholic publications, I'll let you know that Crisis is a Catholic magazine that dates back quite a while. And I know about Eric because he had written a couple of columns that touched on the secession issue, and I think I even quoted one of them in my book, Breaking Away, on secession. And then I was on his podcast talking about secession. And so I perused the site, and I noticed an article on there a little while ago called "War Must Become a Primary Issue for Catholics in Presidential Elections." This was back when the campaign was still live. And it makes a number of important points. And I'm always interested in this overlap between us on the libertarian Rothbardian side of things and people who inhabit other ideological or religious corners of the world, but come to some similar conclusions in different ways or by reading some similar stuff and forming their own opinions that I think are good in the sense of doing what we're trying to do, which is protect human beings, human dignity, human rights, law and order, peace, all those sorts of things that we like at the Mises Institute. And before we get started in our discussion, I just want to note that you can support the Mises Institute by going to Mises.org, MISES.org, clicking on subscribe, or of course clicking on donate if you feel particularly motivated to do that. But I think you'll find this an interesting discussion whether you're Catholic or not, because, of course, there's a lot of history behind this and also very relevant, I think, to a lot of what's going on in modern American foreign policy, and especially over the last 20 years or so. So, Eric, welcome. Thanks for joining me here on Radio Rothbard. And I think I really just want to start off by asking you, in a certain sense, why did you write the column? That is, why do you think that your audience, Catholics in this case, have neglected the issue of war so much in recent decades, right? We find that there's very little debate about particular wars or whether war is justified. There's just sort of a acceptance that, well, people disagree on this and there's not a clear position. And so a lot of people just really aren't willing to tackle the issue. But of course, historically, the church opposed war in general. Of course, and historically, we can go way back, right, to the early Middle Ages. And there's a thing that people never talk about anymore. It was called the Truce of God in the early Middle Ages, where the church had intervened specifically to try and limit the amount of war that the nobility engaged in. And you actually see kind of that tradition come down to us through just war theory and some other aspects of the faith. But you, inhabiting just this modern world of ideological debate about policy and so on, what did you see out there that made you think, really, I just don't think this issue's being discussed enough and I should say something?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. Love the Mises Institute, by the way, and the work you guys are doing. So Crisis Magazine, its audience has always been conservative Catholics, politically conservative Catholics. And in fact, for a long time, very much a neocon. It was a neocon Catholic publication. Crisis Magazine 20, 30 years ago have been very supportive of the Iraq War that W started, the Iraq War before that probably. Very much believed in American interventionism around the world. And so our audience has evolved, like I think conservatives have evolved in a lot of ways on the issue of war on some level. But I would still say the vast majority of conservative Catholics in America are going to be generally pro-American interventionism, it's kind of harsh to say pro-war, but they're not anti-war, I'll put it that way. And so when voting, typically the issues that matter most to the Crisis audience, and to me in a lot of ways too, I don't want to act like I'm not part of that, is abortion, maybe same-sex marriage, the social issues like that, limited government, that, at least in theory, as a Republican would define that. These are all the issues that typically are the biggest ones when it comes to voting. But and so war really isn't part of the equation. I mean, I'm old enough to remember back in the day when the leftist Catholics were against war and the conservative Catholics were more for it. That's not really even true anymore, because the leftist Catholics are now completely support the Biden administration, Obama, and others when they want to go to war. So really all Catholics in America seem to support America's wars and the different various conflicts around the world. And so I felt like this is a real injustice, as you mentioned. Historically, as Catholics, the Catholic Church, obviously we have a long history, so we have a little bit of everything in our history. We have the Crusades, we have Catholic monarchs going to war, things like that. But I don't think people recognize that the church itself, in the popes, the bishops, the official teaching, is always been very hesitant to support war, has always been looking at war as a necessary evil, not as a good in and of itself. And we can talk about that more in a minute. But the fact is, most Catholics today, at least American Catholics, they don't think of it like that. They're like, if America's behind it, then we're for it. And so I felt like when it comes to electing the president, who today, unfortunately, is the single person who determines if we go to war, and that's not the constitutional way, but it's the way, I felt like this is a very important issue. Yes, I'm not saying abortion and these other issues that we conservative Catholics think are important aren't important, but let's be honest here. The President of the United States actually doesn't have, a lot of say in the abortion policies, because now that Roe v. Wade was overturned, that's in the state's hands. So Donald Trump becoming president doesn't have a lot of say in the abortion policies of Idaho or Oregon or something like that. However, he has the most say in whether or not we're going to send troops somewhere, whether or not we're going to support a foreign country in their wars. And so and same with, Kamala Harris when she was running, and Biden, everybody. So the point I'm saying to Catholics is war needs to be, foreign policy, war, interventionism, all those things needs to be very high in our list of priorities, because ultimately it is a human life issue. It is a pro-life, and we say we're pro-life. And so we don't want the deaths of innocent babies by abortion, but we also shouldn't want the deaths of innocent Palestinian babies by bombs, or Ukrainian babies, or whatever the case, or adults. I mean, the point is that there's this real need as Catholics. We have this very strong pro-life stance, and the church has always had that. Well, we need to apply it a little bit more consistently, and I don't think American Catholics have done that, is particularly in the past, decades here in this country.
Right. When I was younger, of course, I remember when the left, right, the anti-nuclear left was dominated by Catholics. And you would hear about these nuns going and protesting in nuclear silos and that sort of thing. That's all just kind of disappeared. You just never hear about that stuff anymore. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely been a shift. And I think really, right, who's even active in the church anymore? It tends to be conservatives now. Kind of the old aging boomers are disappearing and just aren't really relevant anymore. And I think that was kind of the old anti-war left, that was their demographic. And so it's up to the conservatives now if they're going to do, or, at least the more orthodox Catholics, if they're going to do anything. And I think, right, both you and I are well aware of the history of conservatism in America and what that means. Just completely separate from any sort of particular religion, but it's, of course, built very much on a very interventionist foreign policy dating back to the 1950s, especially under Buckley and his allies. So I suppose there's no surprise there that when you inhabit both camps, you're a Catholic Christian on the one hand, but you're also conservative. To some extent, you kind of have to choose which side you're going to come down on. Now, of course, I could tell you which I think is the correct side, but I think a lot of people, they don't think it's that easy. But looking at your column here, you connect, as you hinted at here a minute ago, is that you very much connect the issue of war to the issue of abortion, right? If we're going to claim we're going to be pro-life, that has to include not just babies in utero, but as I used to put it, we also need to care about babies ex utero, right? You're a month-old baby in Fallujah in 2005 as the artillery shells are raining down. Is that respecting human life? Does that make you pro-life to support that sort of thing? And very tragically, I don't think it has anything to do with that, and I think really makes a mockery of the idea that people are pro-life. And I remember also from the old Iraq War days that when they did, speaking back to the conservative issue, they did surveys at the time of what are the politics of people from various religious groups. And I remember surveys saying that people who identified as traditionalist Catholic were more likely to support a free hand for the American regime in terms of torture and things like that. Whatever it was the CIA was doing, it's fine because it's going to make us safe. And it goes back to the whole weapons of mass destruction thing and all of that. Right. And it just seems like there should have been a little bit more critical thinking there in terms of what are we supporting. And there just seemed to be a whole breakdown in the process of any sort of moral logic to the situation. Now, some of that, I think, is just a lack of education, a lack of familiarity with the arguments that have been made historically. And so I think this brings us back then to the issue of just war theory, right? Do people ever talk about that anymore in any sort of serious way? And what do you think we need to learn about that? Do we need to learn more? And I really have no idea what the answer to this question is. Do people who are writing articles on theology and stuff, do they talk about just war theory? Do they care about just war theory? Is it something relevant to modern times?
Yeah, sadly, the answer is no. And I think we should take a step back and just recognize that the Catholic Church is the institution that essentially came up with just war theory. That if you look at the history of the church has reflected upon the issue of war for literally almost, over 1,000 years. I mean, all the way back to St. Augustine. When is it justified to go to war? Because there was this tension. We have obviously the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. It's very obvious, very clear. Don't kill people. But the church did see that, okay, clearly there's some cases where ending somebody else's life can be justified. If somebody has a gun to your head and they're about to shoot you and somebody else shoots them to stop them, that's the only way they can stop them, the church would say that is justified. The church is not pacifist, in other words. It's not saying that you never can take a human life. But they're very clear and very clear directives and guidelines for when you can and when you can't. Likewise, when we're not talking about just a individual self-defense, but we're talking about war, which it is the same concept, same principles as individual self-defense, but now we have a lot of more complicating factors. It's much more complex. And so there's really two different ways, two different principles we have to keep in mind. First is there justification for going to war? And then second, can you justify the actions you take in a war, even if the justification for the war is legitimate? So the first thing is you have to look at, okay, is it justified? Now, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it actually lays out 4 principles for whether or not a war is a just war. And it basically says that okay, at one, and all 4 have to, this is important, all 4 have to be met in order for a country to go to war. Not just one of them, but all 4 of them. The first one is the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. In other words, if some guy from Pakistan comes into America and he happens to, bomb a subway or something like that, awful tragedy. It doesn't mean that it's a lasting and grave and certain attack on the damage to the United States of America. It's not like all of a sudden we need to go to war against Pakistan because this one guy from Pakistan, maybe even he worked for Pakistani government. I mean, but the point is it has to be something very serious. So that's the first thing. The second one is all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. In other words, negotiations always come first. We have to find, is there any way other than war that we can resolve the conflict? And this is something that I think is often forgotten today, because there's just a jump to, they attacked us, we're going to hit them back harder. Not of, okay, do we need to see if there's another way we can do this? That's the second one. The third is, this is an interesting one, there must be serious prospects of success. Now, a lot of times people get upset, like I hear a lot of times people get upset when you say we should negotiate, Biden administration should have got involved in negotiating with Russia in their invasion of Ukraine. And basically the idea being that, listen, Russia's going to win anyway. They're going to get what they want, at least on some level. Let's negotiate that. And they say, oh, no, you can't do that. You know, it's a noble cause and all that. I'm not saying it's not a noble cause for Ukraine to fight back. What I am saying, though, is there serious prospects of success? Because otherwise what will happen is exactly what does happen, which is you have a potential negotiated peace at the beginning. You reject it. You then spend years and years with hundreds of thousands of people dying, destruction all around you. And then what do you end up with? Exactly what you could have gotten at the beginning. I mean, the Afghanistan war is essentially this, where you had 20 years, and after 20 years, trillions of dollars, thousands of lives lost, complete destruction of the land, we end up with what we started with. So there must be serious prospects of success. And the fourth part of that must be met for just war is the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. This is something very few, unfortunately, but some Catholic people are starting to really recognize, is that there may not be such a thing as a modern just war because of the weaponry we have today. That doesn't mean we're pacifists, but it does mean that modern weaponry might make it impossible almost to have a just war. We're not talking about, crossbows or even small rifles or something like that. We're talking about nuclear bombs and even other types of weaponry that just cause mass destruction. And so the point of this is just simply, it is possible that you fight back and make things worse. Just personally, I think this is a perfect example of Israel's response to the October 7th attacks against them by Hamas, is that what was produced by the reaction is evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. And so I would argue at least that the Israeli response does not fall into that category. And so you ask then, is this discussed among Catholics? The answer is really no. I mean, yeah, there's some academics, there's some people like me, maybe some weirdos or something like that. But your average Catholic, American Catholic, and I say this, and I say this as somebody who used to be like this, which is if America's behind it, then it's a just war. I know that was essentially, I would find ways, and if you look back, and I'll say this somewhat with shame, if you look back at some of the articles at Crisis magazine from 20 years ago when the Iraq War was going on, essentially the justification was they would say it's a just war, and it was essentially because America's behind it. I mean, they wouldn't say that brazenly, but that's really what it was. And so, it's the whole Saddam is Hitler, Putin is Hitler, everybody is Hitler. And so therefore, we looked back at World War II, we consider that, we accept that as a just war. Whether or not we should in every way, I'm not claiming that. I'm just simply saying that's the typical thought of the typical American, including American Catholic. And we just say, okay, this is a just war because we're fighting the new Hitler. So I do think this is something I think Catholics really need to tackle with. I mean, it's very clear. I literally read this from the Catechism. It's paragraph 2309. This isn't like some secret. It's just been ignored, and ignored for political reasons, frankly.
Well, the Iraq War remains, I think, the quintessential case of how waging a war gave you something worse afterwards than what you started with, right? I mean, let's look at the many victories of the Iraq War. And of course, for those of you out there who remember those days when the war was heating up, we had a lot of these Catholic columnists like George Weigel and Michael Novak and D.L. Hudson, who at the time was the editor of Crisis magazine back then. And they all got on a plane and they went over, and they were invited by the American ambassador in the Vatican to fly over to the Vatican and tell John Paul II what's what when it comes to war, because he just doesn't understand war. You know, the guy just, he lived in Poland during World War II. What does he know about war? And so they do that, of course, and then the Americans get their war. Let's examine what happened there. Okay, first and foremost, the Christian community in Iraq was decimated and destroyed by the war. Whereas Christianity was a protected minority in Iraq under the secular Hussein regime, the war, the destruction of that regime essentially led to rule by radical Islamists, essentially, in Iraq. They traded in Hussein's authoritarianism for death squads that roamed the country, killing dissidents, suicide bombing everywhere. And then, of course, Christian communities essentially had to go into hiding. Not to mention, of course, the fact that the standard of living plummeted in that country because they couldn't even keep the lights on anymore after all many U.S. bombing campaigns. And then, of course, it created a power vacuum that invited in ISIS, which led to the destruction of ancient Mosul and the Christian monasteries and communities there destroyed. And that's what we got out of that war. And even from a American strategic standpoint, according to the American regime and its goals, it actually made Iraq more sympathetic to Iran, which we're told is the great enemy of America. And so by giving more Shia power to the regime there in Iraq, actually allied that country more with Iran, which I guess, according to U.S. propaganda, would tell me that was a defeat, that was a strategic defeat for the U.S. in Iraq. So looking back, it's difficult to see any sort of justification whatsoever for it. And then I think, just to build upon one of the other points you made, that important distinction between what is just war in terms of deciding if you can go to war, and then what is just war in terms of conducting the war. And I was surprised once to see an interview with Bishop Robert Barron on this, where he was talking about World War II. And he made the point that, yes, the United States, at least in the war in the Pacific, the United States was bombed by Japan. The United States decided to go to war with Japan. It seemed to fulfill all those requirements in terms of going to war. However, how the U.S. conducted itself in the war, that is, with the firebombing of Japan. We don't have to talk about the nuclear bombs, but just the firebombing, where Robert McNamara, hardly a pacifist, the defense secretary during Vietnam, described the war as killing 100,000 women and children in one night. And obviously, that does not conform to what St. Augustine and others were talking about in terms of justice in conducting a war. But that's all just, paved over, forgotten. It's fine. They bombed us. And it's kind of the equivalent of what the state of Israel now says, is Israel has a right to defend itself. So therefore, there can be no rules whatsoever on how we conduct ourselves. That was essentially the U.S. attitude during World War II. The U.S. has a right to defend itself. It doesn't matter how many old people, women and children get burned to death in Tokyo. So you can see how this is a very different standard from what is the usual. But it seems that people professing the Catholic faith, and of course countless others who profess to be other types of Christians, they don't care about these issues, as far as I can tell. Although I'm not really in the thick of it, it's not a world I inhabit on a professional basis. I'm definitely going to take your word for it that this is that this is not really at the forefront of people's minds in terms of what determines our foreign policy as Americans. Now, I think the claim could be made, though. This leads me to my next question for you, though. A lot of people could just simply say, "Well, I don't know. I don't know what's going on in Iraq or Syria or any other country, and so shouldn't I just defer to the people in charge of the country and do what they say?" And of course, this goes far beyond any religious group, right? This is just how the U.S. regime functions and propagandizes people in terms of, well, politics stops at the water's edge, right? When we're talking about foreign policy, you just need to trust your leaders. The experts will tell you what we need to do in terms of foreign policy, because we know all the secrets. We keep an eye on these other people. So just do what we say in terms of foreign policy. So should we just defer to the experts on this, or do we need some other moral calculus that's more important, Eric?
I think this is one thing that is a struggle for Catholics particularly, because obviously as Catholics, we have an institutional respect for authority. I mean, we're based upon, we have a hierarchy that we're under the Pope, we're under bishops, we're under priests. We looked at them as authority, as religious authorities. And so that's kind of baked into our whole religion. And I think it's a good thing. I mean, I'm a practicing Catholic. I believe all this stuff. And I think there's good theological reason for that we would could take hours to defend, but that's not the purpose here. So I do think that I understand why it can be a struggle for Catholics in particular to want to just accept the government authority on something like this. On, like, I don't know what's going, like you said, I don't know that whether or not there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but Colin Powell is suggesting there is, and he obviously knows a lot. So I'm going to defer to him on this. And I think the problem, though, is, and this is something I think a lot of Catholics are waking up to and have been waking up to in recent years because of incidents like Colin Powell and others, back in the day, and in modern times, in Biden administration and Trump and everything, there has become a recognition that there are some conflicting motives going on here when it comes to this run up to wars, run up to conflicts, and support for them. There is a growing recognition among Catholics of the existence of the military-industrial complex. This idea that, the reason that a lot of these people, these politicians, are supporting war and military conflicts is because it helps their donor base. It enriches various military companies and contractors and things like that. So I think this is something I do think more are coming to. I do think we're still too susceptible to propaganda, that when it's like, okay, but this is an existential threat, and so we have to, get together and fight or whatever like that. I think that we still fall for that. But I do see some signs of hope here that people are starting to realize, the experts. I mean, because let's be honest, a lot of the experts, when it came to, for example, COVID, were proven to be wrong. And I think that woke up particularly conservative Catholics, like, hold on a second. The government really did pull a number on us on this one. And maybe they're not really telling the truth about this other stuff. And honestly, Trump has helped this some too, because regardless of his how he governed as president, how he will govern, his language when he campaigns is actually pretty good on this, on things like foreign policy. Now, we all know the history of what he actually did his first time on that. Don't need to get into that. But it did give... Okay, here's a story. In 2015, I wrote an article on my personal blog, and it was about secession. It was about like foreign policy, stuff like that. And all my conservative friends thought I was an idiot. I was just like, they were just like, you're just completely, you turn into a liberal or something like that. I mean, it was just, what you would expect. I write the same thing now, and like I've noticed there's a growing percentage are saying, yeah, I think you're right. And I think Trump did give them kind of the cover to be able to say that. Regardless of how he governs, he does talk a good game often. And so I think that really helped as well to see that, okay, we shouldn't, just the fact that neocon has become a term of derision among a lot of conservatives is a good thing, because they deserve to be, a term of derision for them. And Trump has helped accelerate that. I mean, you hear, like, especially like his son and others will use that term as an insult. And so I think that's something that those are all good things. But so I think the era of just blindly accepting the experts on what they say, I do think is ending. Like the boomer Catholics, they might still go along with that. But I do think there's a growing number, especially younger Catholics. In fact, this is actually a sign for hope, is I think if you poll Catholics, like practicing Catholics by age group, I think as they get younger, they get more skeptical of American foreign policy, more anti-war. I think it really just goes almost directly. I'm somewhat of an oddball being in Generation X and being as anti-war as I am. Typically, though, as people get younger, I can talk into like young people at my parish. It resonates more with them than when I talk to somebody my age or older about these issues.
Yeah, I think you're right. I just in my world, I think I see a lot of reasons for hope there as well. I just remembering 20 years ago, right? All you had to do as the regime was say, well, this other country's doing something we don't like, so we need some boots on the ground. We need to invade. Obviously, this is what we're going to do now. And if you love America, you're going to do what we say. And I don't encounter the same level of enthusiasm from people who are younger than me that I would see back in 2005 or even later, right? I think to some extent the turning point was with Obama, where that was the last time they really tried to drum up support for a big invasion, because they were talking about, we're going to invade Syria with a full-blown force. We want regime change. And there was just zero enthusiasm for that. And that seemed different to me because, of course, being totally cynical, I expected, here we go again. Right. It's going to be the rally around the flag thing, and everybody's going to fall over themselves supporting this war in Syria. And it didn't happen. And even in Ukraine, where you do get a bunch of people saying, yes, we need to support Ukraine more, almost nobody's calling for, just the most crazed war advocates are calling for some sort of U.S. invasion force in that case. So there does seem to be something different going on there. But I wonder if it's something, if there are larger historical currents there, or if it's just people have kind of learned from the failures of the recent past. I guess my final question for you would be, what can people like you and me do to really try and cultivate this change? If there really is a change here, what can we do to really capitalize on it, to really take advantage of the moment, to really try and solidify this opposition to just this ongoing routine of, all right, this foreign country's doing this thing, I guess we have to invade, trust the experts, do what we say, and then once the war is over, we'll enter a golden age of democracy and peace everywhere. If it didn't happen before, it's just because we didn't fight war long enough or hard enough. But this time it'll work. I mean, how can we really cement any gains that we might have made on this issue?
I think at least most of my audience is Catholic. That's where most of I direct my energies is towards fellow Catholics. I think it applies obviously to non-Catholics in a lot of ways in these issues, but I think there should be a real push to remember that the church has always had a deep skepticism towards war, and that should be the default position of any Catholic. If you're Catholic and you claim to be Catholic, especially if you claim to be pro-life Catholic and all that stuff, then you should always be skeptical of any claim to war. So if any leader says we need to invade, we need to put boots on the ground, we need to go to war, the default should be for a Catholic, wait a second, hold on, slow down. And only after they've proven they've checked off the boxes of just war and they can really justify it, because the church also says it is the prudential decision of leaders and the people to decide if it checks that off, because it can't obviously apply this to every situation. But only when they've checked off, only when Lindsey Graham can check off all four of those things, can we say, okay, now we're listening to you, and now we're willing to at least consider support for these actions. But I think what happens is we need to educate, particularly Catholics, on the just war theory. And of course, the just war theory is not really just a Catholic thing. It really is natural law. It really is something that applies to everybody. Because I think the average person of goodwill will see these four stipulations and say, yeah, that makes sense. I think that I like a world where countries followed that before they went to war. I don't care if they're atheist, agnostic, Muslim, whatever. They'd be like, that I'm with you on that. And so I think that's what, as Catholics, as kind of the inventors of it, we need to be the greatest defenders of it. And so I do feel like more Catholics are doing it, but I really feel like we're still dropping the ball. And so I think that's the key, is educate Catholics on the just war theory, and then call people out and say, okay, you said that that Israel is justified in everything they've done in Palestine. okay, does it fall under this part of just war theory? Defend it on this? How can it not be disorders and evils graver than evil to be eliminated? I mean, call out people who claim to support just war theory, because every Catholic will say they support just war theory. In theory only. But when you put it in practice, they forget a lot of these. And you see that because all they think of is just war theory to them is often just like, okay, Hamas attacked on October 7th. Israel has a right to defend itself. That's literally now the end of the entire argument. And it's like, no, just war theory is a lot more. I mean, as we saw when we broke this down, there's a lot more to it than just simply I was attacked and so I can attack back. The truth is actually you can be attacked and not be justified in attacking back. Because I think there's strong arguments, for example, in the case of Israel, they could have defended themselves. They could have kept something like this from happening without actually even having a attack on Palestine, because there's questions of their security and all that stuff. So, and that I'm willing to have a debate about that, because at least now we're accepting the principle that it doesn't automatically mean you can just bomb the living daylights out of somebody, of people, just because some of the people attacked you. So I think that's our key, is really education on the just war theory, proclaiming it. I wish more bishops, Bishop Barron did it, and I think that's great. I wish more bishops did. One thing I just want to mention is I do have a sign for hope, because 40 years ago, when a Catholic, and this actually happened at Crisis Magazine, when a Catholic said that the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were immoral, every Catholic almost in America said, you're an idiot. No way, no way. Today, though, it's a lively debate within Catholic circles. A lot of Catholics will say freely, yes, that was not morally justified. That does not fall under the just war theory, and that should be condemned, that action. And you'll get a lot more now supporting it than would have had 40 years ago. So I do think there's reasons to believe that within Catholics, at least, there is this growing recognition that there's the just war theory is a lot more complex than just you hit me, I hit you back. And so I think that's something to be hopeful about for the future in a growing anti-war movement within the Catholic Church.
And I would agree that that's probably a broader issue in the U.S. as well, is that the fact that there is permissible debate on the issue of how the U.S. conducted that war in Japan. And until really the 1960s, you couldn't even get a book published calling into question official U.S. policy in World War II. It was just, you were silenced. There was hardcore censorship from every publisher who did not want to be in the position of publishing a book saying that, oh yeah, the U.S. nuclear bombing of Japan was not in every way righteous. And it wasn't until the 60s that people started to question that. And yeah, I think that debate continues today, certainly in our circles, as well. So thank you, Eric Sammons, Editor-in-Chief at Crisis Magazine, for joining us today for this important discussion. Thank you all out there for listening to Radio Rothbard. We'll be back next week with more, so we'll see you next time. One more thing, Radio Rothbard listeners, I want to make sure you know about our event coming up on February 22nd. That's Saturday. It's in Tampa, Florida. That is our Educating for Liberty conference. This is our conference discussing the realities of education in America today. How the state has a stranglehold on education from kindergarten to postgraduate programs, and how we need to do something different if we're going to educate for freedom, if we're going to counter the state narratives that are now so common. To do that, we're bringing in some of our top scholars. We got Tom DiLorenzo, our own president. We've got Jonathan Newman, our Henry Hazlitt Research Fellow. We've got Jason Jewell, Chief Academic Officer of the Florida University System, and several others will be covering this topic in some detail. Tickets are $70 for Mises members, $75 for non-members. You can get a discount, 10% off the discount price, if you enter Rothbard25 as your promo code. You go to Mises.org/Tampa25. That's MISES.org/Tampa25 and enter Rothbard25.